welcome to another edition of the Curses and Champions podcast, the exclusive podcast of the Chicago Sports Column. Alongside Ryan Wooden, Darren Zaitlin, I'm Matt Gentile, and we're back from summer break.
Back in black.
It's good to be back.
We're in the outdoors right now, in case you couldn't hear the cicadas buzzing right now.
Yeah,
outdoor
seriously.
podcast.
It's like right outside the damn window.
Yeah, we're right by a window, but the acoustics are good in this room, so that's all that matters. How did everybody enjoy their time away? You guys go to the beach or anything like that?
Colorado.
It's just good to get away from talking sports. Just a lot of real hard work over here in this podcast game, and it's nice to just take a couple of weeks.
Oh yeah, I had to take a break. Had to go to the mountains and isolate myself for a week from everyone.
I just I was a nerd. I decided to just write about the Bulls a lot.
Nerds!
Yeah, really. But it's good to be back, and it's good to be talking about baseball again, and the middle of the season.
All-Star break's coming up.
All-Star break, trade deadline, so it's good to just kind of give a little bit of a recap in here and start with the White Sox. So Ryan, since you're our resident White Sox guy.
The sad music plays in.
Yeah, that sad trombone from The Price is Right just started. First half of the season, what would you say has been the biggest story on the South Side?
Honestly, the biggest story at this point is probably that there hasn't been like a particularly compelling, like super exciting story. The closest thing to it probably is Tim Anderson. If you look at just his stat line in particular, particularly offensively, there's nothing super exciting about it. He's hitting 246. He's only getting on base, at a 304 clip. Slugging's 416 to 720 OPS. Nothing super exciting necessarily about that slash line with the way that we've currently started to look at that slash in particular. However, power numbers are up. He's still stealing a ton of bases. He's walking significantly more than he has throughout the course of his career.
He walks?
Yeah. Surprisingly, he does walk. Now he walks. He didn't used to walk, but now he walks. BABIP is still relatively low for the sort of speed that he has, so there's probably still a little bit more average and slugging for him to bite off and chew. And the most encouraging element of it is he's actually starting to play some really sound defense.
Yeah.
So far this year, he's been worth 4 runs defensively, which he's been a negative runs guy defensively for his first 2-3 seasons in the league.
It's a big-ass jump.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. With Tim Anderson, I think the main focus, with the Sox for this season and the foreseeable future is really going to be like who's going to be these pieces that stay the long term. And so is Tim Anderson somebody that you think is a long term piece for the Sox, or more that piece you dangle later on to acquire some more big chips down the road?
Well, so they signed him to a long extension in basically smack dab in the middle of his rookie year. They were that confident that he was going to be a piece of things. I don't think that he's necessarily progressed the way that they had hoped up until this point. The major defensive strides that he's made, the plate approach refinements that he's made, those are the things that excite him right now. And because they have him on this lengthy deal where he really never gets to be prohibitively expensive, and they have him locked up, I think, through 2023 or 2024, so they have him for a long time if they want him. Now, obviously, because that contract's so reasonable, if they decide that they have a better option at shortstop, if Nick Madrigal, their number 3 overall pick or number 4 overall pick from this summer, who they think can play shortstop, ultimately turns into a potential top tier shortstop, maybe they can consider either moving him, whether it be to another position or to another team. But I think right now he's doing pretty well for himself to continue to play his way into the future. I wouldn't say you necessarily ever looked at him as a guy who, wasn't going to be a part of their future, but it was at least kind of, hemming and hawing a little bit at some point. And those, specifically, again, those defensive improvements he's made and the plate approach refinements he's made, that's what's driving him forward.
Where have there maybe been other pieces on this team where you're like, this is somebody that I could see as a long-term piece?
Well, I think everyone who they were excited about from a prospect standpoint, they're largely still, except Carson Fulmer. He's a dead man walking. You'll see him in the bullpen at some point, I think, down in Charlotte before if you ever see him back in the majors again, because he's struggling just as bad in Charlotte as a starter as he did in Chicago as a starter. So outside of that, I don't think there's necessarily anyone they're ready to just outright give up on as a prospect. I think the disappointing thing has been that there have not been those major step forwards that they would hope to have seen. Yoan Moncada obviously was a guy who we looked at as, hey, maybe he'll be fringy all-star type this year.
I feel like he's had some good, stretches.
You see the talent, consistently for a week, 2 weeks at a time, but he'll just go dormant for a long time. His plate approach this year has been odd. His walk rate's down. His strikeout rate is actually up. and he was already a big swing and miss guy, so it's hard to tell. But you see those flashes of just enormous talent from him, and that's why they're not giving up on him for sure.
Do you think another big, name that I think has made a huge impact at the start of the season is Ronaldo Lopez?
Mm-hmm.
Is Lopez the kind of guy that we've talked about on past podcasts too, but is that still somebody that you see as like ace potential, 2-3? What kind of future do you think he has?
I think very solidly in the middle of the rotation. His numbers are very good this year. Now, the swing and miss stuff that we know he has, because we know he has 98 in the back seat whenever he needs to reach back there and grab it. We know that he has a wipeout slider when he wants to. But honestly, it feels like this year it's been his goal to kind of learn how to pitch to contact and be a little bit more efficient. He's worked, I think, into the 6th inning in 6 of 7 starts and something like 12 of 15. Mm-hmm. So he's starting to become that innings eater guy, and I think he's less focused at the moment on trying to strike everybody out. He can do that at times. Like if he gets himself into a jam, and he's got bases loaded, nobody out, and he knows he needs to pull a strikeout or two to get himself back into a situation where he can get out with limited damage, he can do that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he's definitely pitched to contact more, and so some of the peripheral numbers aren't crazy exciting about him. But I think he's proven just by making those slight adjustments, pounding the zone, and being more efficient that he is, at worst, a middle-of-the-rotation guy for you.
And just to go with what you were saying, 75 strikeouts in 105 innings.
Yeah.
So definitely efficient, but 3.77 ERA is pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Especially when you consider, obviously, he's not getting a ton of run support, and the defense hasn't been great.
Defensive is lackluster, yeah.
Yeah, and he's how old is he? He's
25, I believe.
25?
24.
So, you think about
24.
it. 24. So you think about that. Like, there's still a lot of room to grow in this game. So I think there's definitely encouraging signs. I think, if you find that guy who's even a number 2, number 3 starter, middle of the rotation guy, that's always a good thing in the middle of a rebuild.
Especially when you consider all of the power arms that they still have in their system right now. Like we've talked on this podcast multiple times where their strategy with building a rotation is really going to be throw all these power arms that they have, which they have 10, 12, throw them against the wall, see what sticks, and then whatever kind of falls off, the spaghetti that's not done is ultimately going to be turned into their bullpen at some point. So I think that's still the strategy.
So you use spaghetti to throw at the wall. I always say you throw shit at the wall.
You could throw shit or spaghetti. I will say, in terms of the Board of Health, they are probably more okay with the spaghetti than the shit.
All right, real quick, what's got more stickability, spaghetti or shit? I think spaghetti might have more stickability.
It depends on if it's cooked properly.
Depends on the shit, though.
If it's properly al dente, the spaghetti is sticking.
That's what I was going to say. If you got to do al dente. I'm Italian, so I know this. If you get the al dente pasta, it's sticky enough. Darren, what's your Paisan blood say about this?
I was going to say, if you're going to have that middle-of-the-road shit that's not quite diarrhea, but not the solid one, that one is probably going to stick.
Okay, so if there's 2 things Italians know,
and we all needed that image.
It's pasta and shit because of all the stuff we eat.
Preach.
So, and I'm sorry if I offended any Italian Americans. I know there are a lot of White Sox fans that are of Italian descent.
It is this fucking guy right here.
How many? Yeah, that's how we talk too.
Get out of my face.
But how many heritage nights do the White Sox have? I feel like we got an Italian heritage, we got Greek heritage night. I'm waiting for streets and sanitation heritage
Disco
night.
Demolition night. That's not necessarily like an ethnicity heritage night. It's more along the lines of, hey, remember that time where we legitimately had a disco and almost destroyed this place?
Oh, yeah.
They had a Dexter Fowler night recently.
No, I think Dexter Fowler had an extra.
Oh, there you go. So, another, I think, big first half storyline, and really, it's not a shock because he's been such a good player for the White Sox the last 4 years, or last 5 years. Jose Abreu.
Yeah.
Continuing to produce at a high clip, is on pace for another, solid season.
Yeah.
I think the main question, you brought this up a lot of times on the Chicago sports column, really what his future could be. Is he somebody that's going to stay and be, that locker room piece for some of these younger players coming through the system, or is that somebody that, maybe come end of this month you might see him dangled?
I think they're obviously going to listen to particularly a good offer for him. It does not help him, despite the fact that he's going to be an all-star starter, is still having a very good year. He's mired in arguably the worst slump of his career right at this moment.
That tells you a lot.
256 for the season, actually.
Yeah, it's not, his numbers are not crazy. Now, again, his slash line is still, I think his OPS is over 750 overall. would be, well, I think he'll still finish well over 800. He's just in a bit of a slump right now. He's got 27 doubles, though. I think a dozen home runs. So he's got almost 40-plus extra base hits. He's going to be a guy who has 60, 70 extra base hits, which is a great year.
I kind of want to throw this out there. Do you think, a guy like Jose Abreu, do you think your stat line struggles a little bit when you're probably one of the only legitimate threats in the middle of the line?
Without a doubt. He hasn't had much protection. And when he has had protection, the guys who have started to, start to hit relatively well, Matt Davidson, he got hurt and was out for a stretch. Avisail Garcia, who's back and is hitting very well now, was both hitting poorly and injured for 2 months prior to this tear that he's gone on. So he hasn't had that protection both in front of and behind him. He hasn't had both, Avi Garcia hits in the 2-hole in front of him. So having Avi there hitting well and being on base in front of him is a huge catalyst for him offensively. And then having a guy like Davidson in the 4-hole behind him, making sure that he gets pitches to hit, is a huge element of his success. And he has not had that. The lineup has constantly fluctuated, especially when those guys were injured. So you just never know what he's going to get from a pitching standpoint on a day-to-day basis. He gets, while I don't want to put him in the Barry Bonds category in terms of the player he is, he gets the Barry Bonds treatment in a lot of ways, particularly with those worst Giant teams that he was on where there's just not a lot else to worry about. Yeah. So there's no reason to pitch to him.
So if you were the White Sox, what would it take for you to part with a piece like Jose Abreu, and what do you think they will potentially get?
So I think they're going to maintain this company line that, hey, we like the idea of him being both a bridge and a clubhouse leader because we have some of these Cuban youngsters. That, for them, I think is more posturing than anything. It's true. Don't get me wrong. It's not like an outright false statement. He is a good leader. He's a strong presence in that clubhouse, and having him be a Cuban with guys like Moncada and Luis Robert coming through, Luis Robert.
Yeah, Luis Robert.
That Luis Robert guy.
The Luis Robert, I think, is going to be a really good guy. He kind of reminds me of me. I know a guy named Lou. I know a guy named Robert. You don't look like him, though. But that's okay. I still like him.
But ultimately, I think that is more posturing than anything. It's to make people not think like, hey, we're just going to sell him to the highest bidder, or we feel obligated to sell him, particularly in this deadline. They've got arbitration for next year, so they could theoretically, if they don't see the right piece dangled in front of them, what I think it would take right now is they'd love to see a top 100 prospect come back for him. Now, it stinks because, no, I don't think so. Not with this slump in particular. I think there are going to be teams who would potentially be interested, particularly in the American League. If you could take him off the field defensively, it enhances his value significantly because while he is not a major liability in terms of his glove work at first base, he just doesn't move all that well. And so he doesn't give you the range of some of the more elite defensive first basemen. And he does cost them runs there, inevitably, in terms of all the metrics that you look at. So that certainly holds back his overall value. So the ideal situation, obviously, is probably a contender who has a slugger who gets hurt, and they need that stability in the middle of their lineup, and maybe you can pry a top 100 prospect for him there. Otherwise, I think they're content going into 2019 and maybe trying to move him at that next deadline.
All right, I got a fun question to throw out about Jose Abreu. If he does get dealt, where would you, just for shits and giggles, like to see him play down the stretch?
I would love to see him go to a contender because I respect him, like as a White Sox fan.
Which contender do you think that would be a fun one to see him on?
It's like I can't see him on Boston or New York because
their lineups are too loaded.
Yeah,
I got one that you've seen some of the rumors pop up. I'd love to see him on the Houston Astros.
And the Astros could work because it's
feasible.
Yeah, the first base situation there is, and they can obviously use him as a DH as well.
What about Seattle need a first base?
I was going to say the Mariners could work. I think they have what's his face? They have a first baseman, I believe.
Hannigan. Is it Hannigan? Because I know that guy has been raking this year.
What's his first name?
I know they have Vogelbach, who
Mitch Hannigan.
Dan Vogelbach has as many home runs as Mike Montgomery does.
Nuts.
And they were traded for each other.
My God, Vogelbach. I remember that piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Haniger he's an 860 OPS guy now at the moment. He's got 18 homers. So they're set okay at first base.
But you DH him.
They lost Robinson Cano for a while. So they could certainly use... Right?
Yeah, because he got hurt and then got suspended.
Yeah. Yes.
They could certainly use another bat. And obviously it's a team that's 20-plus games over 500 at this point. So it puts him in a situation where he could potentially be a major impact. The question is, obviously are they going to pony up enough?
Now, what would be really interesting is if a team like the Nationals calls, could you see him in a scenario like that in Washington right now?
They're desperate.
I mean, they're desperate. Rizzo likes to, make deals happen if he thinks he's going to get a piece.
And that's the thing. I think to an extent, the jury is still out on Jose Abreu defensively. Mm-hmm. There are people who, if you watch a baseball telecast and you talk specifically to a scout, someone who's not necessarily locked into the UZR or all these defensive metrics that we use to ultimately judge players, who think Jose Abreu is average defensively. Yeah. I mean, again, his glove work, he picks the ball fairly well at first base. Balls that are hit at him, he handles with relative grace and class. He understands the game really well. He actually has a very strong arm for a first baseman. He just doesn't move that well.
Right, and I guess it just depends about the defense you have around you. So you have that second base you have what's his name?
Makata, who's struggling.
No, I'm saying if you let's say
for the Nationals,
Washington, it's
Daniel
Murphy. I don't know why I was blanking on it. So
fuck that guy.
Yeah, I know. He's still every time I see his face, I just want to punch it. That's the only piece of Cubs tidbits we'll throw into this podcast. So I guess other than Jose Abreu, there's probably going to be some other names that we're hearing about being dangled at the deadline. You brought up Avisail Garcia.
Yeah,
you kind of take us into that. What do you think could make him an attractive piece potentially, and what could he bring in return?
Well, so Avi's a weird one because obviously All-Star last year, hit .330. Looked like he was finally coming into that kind of mini Miguel Cabrera, billing that he had gotten as a prospect. Finally looked like he's coming into his own. Then he was hitting really, really poorly in the first month of the season and got hurt. And suddenly all that trade value was gone. It looked like the White Sox were a little bit crazy for not having tried to deal him in the offseason. And then he comes back from injury. Now he's absolutely tearing the cover off the ball again. Yeah. And so the value over the course of 2 weeks is built back up. The problem with that becomes we've now seen Avisail Garcia be on the disabled list for extended stretches each of the last 3 years. He's a bigger, bulky, more muscular guy who's run into muscle issues and ligament issues now at this point in his career, which is concerning. And he's just there's enough unproductivity in his career to match some of the recent productivity to give you pause for concern. And so my concern ultimately would be, he twinged his hamstring again recently, having significant issues with that again. And so you wonder if that, again dings his trade value. Yeah. But he's a guy who's going to go to arbitration next year and probably get in the neighborhood of $10 million.
Yeah.
Whereas a guy like Matt Davidson, who I know we'll get into in a little bit more depth later, is a guy who they have at a minimum contract $545,000 for 2 years. Mm. So it's easier to sit and wait with a guy like Davidson than it is with Avi Garcia because he's going to be a free agent in 2020. I don't think they're going to give him big money if he's deserving of it. So deal him if you can.
And I think the thing is, I would just take whatever you can get from him because you're going to have a logjam in that outfield.
That outfield is going to get very, very busy as early as next year and certainly by 2020 come free agency time with him, where the only way I can foresee them wanting to hold on to Avi, which he is only 27, so if he is coming into this prime of his career and what we've seen over the course of the last 18 months is real, it would be great to keep him. You'll make space for him in the outfield, but at what cost?
Right.
And again, you have so much risk tied into it because of the injury history now and the fact that he wasn't very good for 3 years.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true. He's been that guy. It's funny, the mini Miguel Cabrera. I feel like we heard that when they acquired him, and Kenny Williams ate that shit up for years.
Yeah.
And one of the issues in baseball, if you have those muscle injuries, those hamstring, any ligament issues, those kind of things, they linger for a long time.
Especially with a guy who's 6'4", 240.
Yeah.
He moves relatively well, so he gets stuff, a lot of momentum build up, and stopping and starting can be problematic for him. And I think that's why, obviously, he's run into the hamstring issues that he's run into this year. So if you get an opportunity, in my mind, you got to pull the trigger, and you got to do it quickly. I mean, I think this season is a perfect microcosm. We've seen him go to, being potentially maybe worth a top 100 or a top 150 prospect in the offseason to worth next to nothing. You would just move him if you could, and then suddenly in 2 weeks again he comes back and he's maybe back into the fringe of being worth a capable big league prospect. Mm-hmm. So I think if you get an opportunity, if the right offer's out there, you gotta pull the trigger.
You brought up Matt Davidson.
Mm-hmm.
Now Matt Davidson, you brought up the contract situation, how it could be a more affordable option. I know we've talked on past podcasts about whether or not he might be potentially a long-term piece or just somebody that's going to be that bridge piece. I know it's probably been close to a month since we last discussed it, but do you still think he's somebody that mainly as a bridge piece, but could eventually turn to that long-term piece? Or how do you see him? And if you got a good offer for him, what would you do?
Well, once again, if you get a good offer for him, I think you pull the trigger because you're not going to have those huge opportunities. And again, I'm just not as convinced about his overall abilities to say for sure, like, yeah, he's going to be a part of this when all of these major prospects wind up showing up in the big leagues. What he does give to you ultimately is he's a solid 3 outcome guy. Now that he does walk, and he walks at a very, very consistent rate throughout the course of this year, it does not appear to be, a random thing that he's suddenly been a player who can take a walk and get on base for you. So his plate approach has been refined. He hasn't sacrificed any of the big-time power that he came with. I feel very comfortable in saying that power and the ability to draw a walk are going to be things that he will continue to have moving forward. And then you have the fact that, he's not a very good defender, but he can play both corners. Mm-hmm. And obviously you can stick him in there at DH when necessary. And so there's some versatility there that I think is of value to you. And so with the fact that he doesn't even hit arbitration at the earliest until 2020, you've got him for $545,000 a year for the next 2 years. I'm okay with them holding on to him unless they get a crazy good offer.
So what would you define as a crazy good offer for a guy like Matt Davidson?
I would think it would have to be a player who is, let's say, in an average Major League system, because again, I don't know where necessarily he'd be shipped off to, but obviously American League teams are going to have, a better idea of what they can do with him because of the DH position. So let's say a middle-of-the-road American League farm system, I would think it would have to be a top 10 to top 7 prospect in that particular system, which may mean he's, a top 200, 250 overall prospect in baseball. I think those are guys who you could say comfortably project to be big league players. At the very least, depth additions to a big league roster. So I think, that is probably something that you pull the trigger on. But again, unless it is a player of that caliber, or certainly a player of higher caliber than that, I don't think they're going to feel the rush to pull the trigger on him because, he gives them a little bit of versatility in the infield. He hits pretty well, and he's dirt-ass cheap for the next 2 years.
And I think, like we were saying about Abreu and Garcia, you might be able to maybe get a little bit more for them, and you might as well part with those pieces because they're a bit older too. Mm-hmm. So what are some other guys we should keep an eye on? I know you've mentioned in passing, before we started recording, we were talking about bullpen arms.
Yeah, I did a piece on ChicagoSportsColumn.com. I think it was probably 2, maybe 3 weeks ago now at this point, that really looked through all of the trade chips that they had available to them. And I think the bullpen is probably the most realistic spot for them to be able to bolster their farm system right now. Again, I think with Garcia, with Davidson, with Abreu, they're going to kind of bide their time because they have a little bit of contract flexibility. They've got all those guys till 2020 if they want to keep them. Whereas the bullpen arms, bullpen help it's a bullpen game now. Mm-hmm. You've got, particularly obviously in National League situations, but even in American League situations, because of the DH, you got teams that are carrying 13, pitchers now, and so being able to have lefty-righty specialists, being able to have guys who can do a variety of things is of value to everybody that's out there. So I think the fact that the White Sox bullpen has had a major resurgence over the course of the last 2 months or so has built a lot of value back up for some of those pieces. So guys like Joakim Soria, Xavier Cedeno, to a lesser extent, I would say that
I feel like Soria actually might get some attention too for a lot
he's
of
probably
those teams
the most valuable.
He's like 80 years old, isn't he?
He's 114 actually. No, he's 34. But he's proven. I mean, we've seen him in closing situations for playoff teams. We know that he has that sort of ability. He's been very, very good. He had a very, very bad start for the White Sox, but he's been excellent over the course of the last 2 months. All the peripheral numbers are good. He's striking a lot of people out. The fielder independent stuff. He's actually been their most valuable pitcher in terms of WAR this year. He's the one player who I think alone, from a bullpen's perspective, could turn back, a fringe major league prospect. Mm-hmm. However, I'm actually of the mind that of the 4 guys they have who I think are dealable, which is Soria, Luis Avalon, Xavier Cedeno, and Nate Jones, who Nate's hurt right now, make things a little bit more complicated. But the 4 of them, I think, all have potential value, and it's 2 righties, 2 lefties. I think the best way for them to go about this would be to split them into pairs, a righty-lefty pair, and give a nice bullpen injection for any contending team that's there. They did a similar deal last year with the Yankees, where they took Tommy Conley, David Robertson, and then also had Todd Frazier in that deal, and were able to deal them for a couple of actually noteworthy prospects. So, again, I don't think any of those bullpen guys are necessarily worth a ton by themselves, but if you start packaging them together, you might be able to return a prospect of note for them.
Could you potentially take those bullpen arms and package them with, a Garcia and an Abreu to try and get an even bigger haul?
I think they would absolutely do that in a heartbeat, and that deal with the Yankees last year proves that. If they could take, say, a guy like Garcia who's worth, let's call it a top 150 prospect, and that's being generous. But then you also would take a guy like Soria and say, particularly Xavier Cedeno is probably the better of the two lefties they have available. You put the three of those guys together in a package, and now it's fairly easy to see that he would be worth probably even more than that Yankees deal, which turned them back Blake Rutherford, who's a top 100 prospect at the moment. So
every time I hear Blake Rutherford, I think we're talking about like an 1800s president.
Rutherford?
I got Blake Rutherford.
With a monocle?
Yeah, does he have a curly mustache?
He's in one of those secret societies. He's a Yale man.
He's a Yale man. Oh, bully. I was at the club today in the barber shop getting leaded.
You know who I saw? Blake Rutherford. You know what he's up to these days? He's an oil magnate.
My God.
That rascallion Blake Rutherford. So why don't we wrap it up here by just getting into what we could expect in the second half. I think the big thing you always hear about, I think I ask this to you every podcast. I feel like a broken record a lot with the White Sox. It's about development. Mm-hmm. Hey. But I don't know why I turned to Jack Brickhouse. Hey.
Because you got to get the Cubs in somehow.
Damn it. Don't say that word. Second half, though.
Okay.
Guys, this is my show. Stop with your Cubs stuff.
Stop ruining my show. But for the second half, the question that constantly gets asked, and I've asked it a ton, who could we expect to come up? Who do you not want to see come up? Who do you want to see come up?
I think it's going to be disappointing to an extent. Guys who I'm confident you'll see at least in September are going to be Kopech and Eloy Jimenez because they're on the 40-man roster. Depending on how they potentially massage their service time next year, you could play them for a month this year, wait a month next year to call them up, and essentially have everything wash out and still have all of the time you need before they hit arbitration. So they can manipulate that situation in a way that you should see them in September and see what they're made of. Honestly, besides that, though, I don't think you're going to see even the guys who were tearing the cover off the ball and really kind of surprising people, rapidly rising through the system. A name that comes to mind would be like Dane Dunning. Dane Dunning started in high A Winston-Salem, has been incredible there. Gone to Birmingham. Birmingham has been even better in Double A. I think it won't be long before you wind up seeing him in Charlotte this year. And in that sense, I think a lot of people are looking at him as probably the most consistent of those White Sox pitching prospects. So, yeah, some people probably would like to see him in September. I don't think they're going to rush anybody along like that, though. I don't think you're going to see Jimenez and Kopech. Maybe Jimenez. Maybe Eloy Jimenez they'll turn to after the All-Star break. Because,
maybe do the September call-up on him?
Yeah, I think both Kopech and Jimenez are going to be September calls because of their 40-man roster status. Jimenez is, I think, the only guy who maybe you see before that of those big-name prospects. And I think the rest are really going to be kind of plug-and-play. They're going to go bullpen. I think you might see Ian Hamilton at some point who's in AAA and throwing the ball really, really well. You might see some of those younger power arms in that capacity. But I really don't think they're going to rush anybody along at this point. The one who would be interesting, maybe Sebi Zavala, who is one of the two catching prospects they have. He was the one that got moved up from Birmingham to Charlotte. He's in AAA right now. If something catastrophic happened to either Omar Narvaez or Kevin Smith, it wouldn't be entirely outside the realm of possibility that Sebi Zavala would get a call up, in the next couple of weeks. So.
The comedian, Kevin Smith?
I think we've done this before with the director, Kevin Smith.
I think he was actually out of town. We did literally the joke about him getting a heart attack.
I'm back, guys. Yeah.
Well, it's it's going to be interesting, I think, down the stretch here to see, who gets called up. And I know that a lot of people are going to be paying attention to
It's going to be disappointing to a lot of White Sox fans because you're just not going to see some of these guys. They're going to just hold service time, and 2019 is going to be the year.
And I think it's the right call. I think anytime you can hold back that service time, you do it.
Cubs did it with Chris Bryant.
Oh, man, we had to bring the Cubs in.
All right. To get an extra year of them.
You got to write what you know.
Absolutely. And so we're going to have plenty of White Sox content over at the Chicago Sports.com. probably written by Ryan, most likely 100% surely written by Ryan. So just visit us at www.chicagosportscolumn.com. If you want the latest updates, articles, and podcasts, follow us on Twitter at Chi Sports Column. That's CHI Sports Column. Or like us on Facebook, like I like to say. We love to be liked.
Mm-hmm.
At least
Who doesn't?
I need approval all the time. So
Yeah, shut up.
That's what my therapist tells me. Shut up.
Shut up and leave. Where's my $100?
That's cheap.
Alongside Ryan Wooden, Darren Zaitlin, I'm Matt Gentile. Thanks for listening.